If you've got an AutoTrickler version 4 and you're interested in getting it to go faster and maintaining some good accuracy on your drops, then this video might help you. So I've been carefully kind of looking at how the AutoTrickler system works with this dual tube setup, and I've been playing with all the settings, and I think I've got a pretty good handle on what the settings do and how they're supposed to work. There's not really a detailed guide on all the advanced settings. So if you're not familiar with the app, inside the app in the settings, you've got detailed settings. Now, if you're not aware, if you hold down on this close button, this is the default, what it shows you. It shows you these very simple settings. Well, you can get to the more advanced settings by just holding down on the close button. And so you can see there's all kinds of stuff in here, and there's not really a good guide on what all this is or what you should do if you're struggling with accuracy or speed. So I want to first start off, before I get into the settings, of just talking about how the AutoTrickler system works with these dual tubes. Basically, whenever you tell it a charge to drop, it's going to calculate how long it thinks that should take using the flow rates that come whenever you calibrate your powder. So whenever you calibrate your powder, it puts in these flow rates up here. And basically, if you think, oh, I'm going to drop, 50 grains of powder, and your large tube on fast speed drops 20 grains a second, well, that's going to take 2.5 seconds at that speed to drop that much powder, mathematically. But that's a very stochastic process. There's a lot of variance in that drop. So the first pass, it kind of calculates how much it needs to drop, but it doesn't go all the way. And so that's where all these settings come in. At some point, it's going to, use that large tube for a while, and then it's going to switch to the small tube and try to approach that weight slowly, trickling up. The next thing to understand is it uses the scale to tell it where it is, but the scale cannot provide live feedback to the system because the scale takes a little bit to register weight changes. So like if I dribble some powder in here, just manually, you can see it takes a bit for that thing to update. Right? So it doesn't happen immediately. And in the couple of seconds of settling time, you could have dropped, if you're using the fast setting on the large tube, you could drop another 40 grains of powder. So it has to have some sort of kind of fuzzy logic on how to approach, what it's doing. So there's a transition setting where it says, okay, at this point, switch from the large tube to the small tube, but it can't actually know what the weight is at that moment. So it just kind of guesses, all right? And so you have to understand that that's what's going on. It doesn't actually check the weight. I mean, it keeps track of it during the drop, because if you go over, it will immediately stop. But it will have a little bit of lag, right? Because it does take a bit. So it is monitoring the weight to make sure it's not going over. But as long as it's not going over, it's kind of following its little program, and it only really tries to be really careful at the very end when it's trying to trickle. So what you'll see whenever this thing goes to drop powder, you'll see it use the big tube for a while, then the big tube will slow down, and once it stops, it will do a little back rotation, and that's because it wants to keep powder from dribbling out, so it kind of back rotates to slide the powder up in the tube a little bit. Then it transitions into the small tube, which will start off fast, then it will slow down, and then it will start trickling. All right. So important things coming out of that are there's basically two types of overthrows that happen. There's an overthrow from the big tube running too long, and then there's an overthrow from the small tube. And so really the goal whenever you're setting this thing up is to use the large tube as much as possible without getting an overthrow, then use the little tube as little as possible without getting an overthrow. So basically you want as much powder being dropped out of that big tube as possible because it's a lot faster. So let's look at the settings and I'll try to explain what's going on. So if you look with the speed selection that's built in, you can see all these things change whenever you move this, right? And there's a speed for the small tube and a speed for the large tube separately. So if you set it to max speed on both, this is what the settings look like. If you scale it down to the slowest possible, this is what it looks like. And so this kind of tells you what direction each one of these settings move the speed, right? So if we start off looking at the large tube settings, if I go to max, there we go, you can see the first three get smaller, and then the fourth one, the minimum speed, actually goes to the right, right? So if I go back to fast, oh, there we go back to fast, you can see the minimum speed moved to the left, the other three moved to the right. So the top two are how long it wants to calculate to run at the higher speed on the big tube and the lower speed on the big tube. Through all my trials, what I have found is those don't really matter that much. Now, they might matter for really large drops, like if you're doing 70 grains plus of powder, then those might actually matter. But if you look at my calibration, I've got 23.1 grains per second. And if you run at high speed for 2 seconds, that's 46 grains of powder, which is more than I'm going to need because I'm going to be dropping, 41.5 classic 4350 powder drop. So those really won't come into play that much. So you can basically take those and just swipe them to the left, and you don't have to worry about it. The next thing is the target weight. Now the target weight interacts basically with the transition weight, because what's going to happen is if I tell this thing, hey, drop 42 grains, it's going to look at the transition weight, and at that point, that's where it's going to stop using the big tube and switch to the small tube. But it doesn't try to hit it precisely, all right? That little target weight basically tells you at what point in there is it close enough to where it just goes ahead and it starts using the small tube. Because there's a lot of variation here, and you don't want to target exactly, right? You want to basically get it set up so that it's not trying to be super precise with the big tube. You want to leave it some room for error. That way you don't get overthrows, because if you try to hit it on the button with the big tube, you will get overthrows. All right, so what I've started off with is let's just set this thing to go slow. And so I'm going to set the small tube to slowest settings, which are take all these three at the bottom and move them to the right. Now they're pretty similar to the speed to the they're pretty similar to the large tube settings. High speed time, low speed time, and a target weight. And that target weight's basically, if it measures and it's within that range, it's going to start trying to dribble powder. And so that's basically what those do. And then the high speed and low speed I'll talk about in a moment. So with the large tube, we're going to start off again with those two going really fast. I want to set the target weight really high. And what that's going to do is it's going to give kind of a lot of room for error. And on the transition weight, you can also move this to the left, and that's also going to slow the system down. On the minimum speed, whoop, messed that up, I'm going to move it all the way to the right. So I should, by the way, before I keep going, let me mention this minimum speed setting, because it is kind of the oddball up here. Minimum speed is whenever the big tube starts slowing down, it will start to creep. And basically, if you want to limit that speed, you can turn that up, right? So if I move that up, it will never go below a certain speed, basically. So if you go to the right, that's faster. If you go to the left with that setting, it's slower. And so basically, if I've got it set all the way to the left here, it's going to turn really slow, and you'll see it really slow down before the transition. Okay, so what this has done is it's basically currently got the tubes where it's going to try to run them really fast, but it's not going to try to run them very precisely. It's going to give a lot of buffer. So with these settings, let's go ahead and let's do a drop. And so again, what you're going to see is I'm going to drop, let me do like 70 grains. Just so you can see. So it's going to run at a fast rate with the big tube. Then it's going to start slowing down. And then, since I have it set to transition about 3 grains away from the end, if I set it to 70 grains, you'll see about 67 grains, it's going to flip over to that small tube. All right, so here we go at 70. All right, there's the fast, it slows down, then it does that little back turn, and there you go. All right, so that's good enough. We don't need to run it all the way. Okay, so how can you make the thing then go faster from this point? Because what we saw is we didn't do an overthrow, right? So nothing was wrong, so we clearly can go faster than that. So what you want to do at this point is with whatever mass that you're trying to drop. So I'm going to go with 41.5 grains. That's how I'm going to do my testing. I want to test it at the weight I'm going to drop. That's kind of the best way to do it. What I found is you really want to test it with the lightest weight that you're going to drop, because if it'll drop the lightweight well, when you increase the weight, it's going to do fine. If you run all your tests on a heavy weight, then you might encounter overthrows on lighter weights because it's kind of tuned to run for that higher weight, and it will tend to overshoot the lower weight. So you want to tune it with a lighter weight on your throws. So what I'm going to do to speed it up, there's a couple things I can do. One thing I could do is this minimum speed. I could crank that up. Now what that's going to do is it will keep the large tube from slowing down as much. And that's going to make the point at which it actually stops a lot more volatile. But that may be okay if our transition weight is large enough such that that volatility doesn't overcome the gap that we've got set. Okay, so I turned the minimum speed up to 1.5, and so let's run it and watch what happens. What we should see is it doesn't slow down nearly as much there. Now, it's not going to help your trickling at this point because, again, we haven't messed with the small tube settings yet. And again, for now, let's just stop it because we're just working on that large tube. Okay, so here's something that whenever I was messing with this, I kind of stumbled upon. If you look inside the large tube, it's got threads, basically, right? And one thing that I decided to try is one of the sources of overthrows with the large tube is if you've got everything set really tight on the transition and your target weight, you'll get overthrows with the big tube because whenever it does that little backup turn, some of the powder at the very end just falls out. And so what it seems like is that it thinks it's okay, but it's not accounting for the powder that could drop out of one of those threads whenever it backs up. So I ran a little test, and what you can do is manually turn this thing, and if you look in here, you can see that there's powder, and let me pull this up so you can see. There's powder nested in those threads. And so what I did is I kind of hand turned and calculated the average weight that came from one thread full of powder. All right, so I'll show you kind of what I mean. Let me get this up here. So if you turn this, you'll see as I turn it, powder starts to slide out of these threads. So that first one only has like 3 grains, 3 kernels in it, and that's not really going to count. I'm going to use the next 3 and drop them out. So that's 1, there's 2, and this is touchy because they kind of overlap some, so that is kind of a problem with this method. Okay, so there we go. That was 3. And you can see about 2.74 grains of powder out of 3 threads. And so my thought was, well, the average per thread out of that, you know, a little under a grain, about 0.9 grains of powder. So what that kind of led me to do with the settings is I'm going to set the target weight to be above that 0.9. I definitely don't want to go below that because when that thing backs up, it is likely to drop some extra powder that's unaccounted for, and I want to account for that in the settings. So I definitely don't want that target weight to ever be below, you know, 0.9 grains. And to give myself a safety buffer, you know, I'm probably going to say, let's just make it like 1.5 for now. And that should be good. Now, if you find that you're still getting overthrows, maybe, you know, adjust that up. So the next thing is, because again, I know that out of each thread of the large tube powder, it's going to get me roughly a grain. I'm also going to shrink my transition weight. Instead of 3 grains, I'm going to pull that over, because I know it shouldn't have a problem, you know, unless I get below like 1 grain. So I'm going to move it down to like 1.5 also, which is again, counting, hey, it may drop a thread of powder. That's going to be roughly a grain. I don't want to get that close, and so leave myself some buffer, and I'm going to set that at about 1.5. Right, so my target weight is 1.5. My transition weight is 1.5. I shouldn't have a problem with the large tube plowing so much powder that I never even use the small tubes. That shouldn't really happen that much. Now, if it ever does happen, you just increase one of those settings, and that will give it a little bit more buffer, right? But what we've done is we basically now have the large tube running as fast as possible while accounting for its drop variation. And you can see already that transition tightened up a lot. All right, so that's one of the main things that you got to do, is make sure that we're using that large tube as much as possible. You know, waiting and making your transition as late as possible. You don't want to spend much time on the small tube. So that's step one. So now we need to tune in the small tube. Okay, so it's obviously going way too slow. Okay, so what we can do, then we're going to go in our settings, and the high speed time I have found is totally irrelevant for the most part. After you've done that tuning and you've gotten the large tube kind of tightened up, it's really not too much. It's really hardly ever going to use the high speed setting. So I'm going to set that to 0, or not 0. I'm going to pull it all the way left. I'm going to set the low speed rate all the way to the left, and then I'm going to leave the target weight alone for now. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at 0.1 grains. So this I'm expecting to get an overthrow from the small tube because I have it set way too fast. Okay, now that was a large tube overthrow. We're over by a couple of tenths of a grain. Right, so in that case, since I did get that, I can come back and I am going to increase my transition just a bit, pull it back to like 1.8, because again, I went over by 0.2, so I'm going to give it a little bit more than that as a buffer in the transition weight. That was kind of my theory, because again, if it threw over by 0.2, I want to pull that transition back at least 0.2. Let me run it again. Okay, there we go. Small tube. So right now we are in that last tenth, and you can see how slow it's dribbling. So that's what that last bottom setting is controlling, right? So that target weight, once it gets within that range, it's going to just putter, because every time it moves, it's going to wait for the scale to give it feedback. And so that really does take quite a bit of time. That was okay, but again, from experience, I am expecting not to be able to go quite this fast on the small tube. Let's see. And that was dead on. All right, so this is where, again, it takes a long time to trickle. So we're going to speed up the trickling and see what happens. So I'm going to come in here, and on the very bottom setting, I'm going to pull that down. So let's pull that down to half a grain, or not half a grain, a 5/100th of a grain, and see how that gets us, right? All right, so here we go. So you can see it creeps up a lot faster now. And this is kind of, at this point, it's close. All right. So at this point, quite frankly, the tutorial about how to tune the thing is basically over. From here on out, it's tweaking as you run this thing, as you get overthrows, knowing what to slow down based on what type of overthrow you get. Okay. Because occasionally you will get overthrows simply because during the trickle, it will get a couple of grains of powder all at once. And there's really no way to tune that out, right? If the trickler is dropping 2 grains when it only thinks it's going to get one, you can't really tune that. But now, if it's just going too fast, then what you might do is come in here to the settings and increase the low speed time, right? Right there was an overthrow, right? So I would probably increase the low speed time up to maybe 2 seconds, right? And so that should help it creep up on that final drop instead of running over. Now, if you find that you're getting a lot of overthrows, then you pull it back. If you find that you're never getting an overthrow, and there was another one, and that was, again, kind of a large tube thing, and this is where, at this point, you kind of got to work with a little bit. So maybe we increase the target weight just a touch. And then run it. Okay, so once again here we're trickling, and there we go. All right, so again, now it's close, and from here on out, it's just tweaking those settings, right? If you find that you get an overthrow, then you might back it off a touch. If you find that you're never getting overthrows, well, then you might be able to speed it up a bit. But again, there's always some trade-offs, right? There was a little overthrow on the trickler, and that's where, again, it's really hard to tune out whenever it gets just a few grains of powder built up. With stick powder, it's just real hard. And that is a little harder to tune. And so this is where you got to ask yourself kind of how fault tolerant you are. If you're okay, with a overthrow and you can just dump it. And again, at this speed, this thing is dropping 41.5 grains of powder. That was like 6 or 7 seconds. So if you have a bad one, you can do 2 drops in less than 20 seconds, pretty much no problem. So yeah, you might get some overthrows, but it's really not going to cost you that much time, right? I mean, because this thing is at this point, it's going very, very quickly. And where you do get slow is always going to be that trickle. And, sometimes you're just going to have slower throws because it needs to trickle a little bit because of where it stopped. If you find that it's just trickling way too long, that is that bottom setting, that target weight on the small tube. You can shrink that up and it will try to get closer without trickling, right? So if I move it to 0.03, at this point, we shouldn't see it trickle hardly at all because it's going to use that small tube speed setting right up until it gets right there. But this is where you're likely to get more trickle overthrows. But bang on there. So let's do one more. I know you've been just watching it drop, but this is kind of what you can expect. All right, so a little bit over, and that's the problem, right? Whenever you keep that whenever you keep that target weight really, really tight, it does tend to shoot over. So I'm going to move it to 0.04. Yeah, still kind of giving me some overthrows. So that's where I'd probably slow that down. And, like I said, it's an iterative process. At this point, the tuning is just little bitty tweaks and finding out just how fast you can push it. But, if you're, watching this and you're seeing how fast it's going, this thing is routinely hitting these drops in, 10, 12 seconds, or sometimes less, depending on what happens. Again, where they're really slow is if it has to trickle a bit. So let's do one more. All right, so yeah, about 10 seconds on a drop there. So anyway, that's how I've kind of decided to do this tuning. Just to show you what happens whenever you got the thing well tuned. At big drop weights, you're using the large tube for most of it. So what's very interesting is that your drop time is not going to change nearly as much as you might think. So if we go to something really ridiculous, like let's drop 200, right? And watch how fast this one goes. right? So we're over a little bit, but that was also like under 10 seconds. So again, we could play with a little bit at a massive throw like that. 2/10 may not be that big, but at this point you got to tweak the settings and get it set up so that you don't get overthrows. But yeah, that's kind of what I've determined as far as getting this thing close. Um, that's the best way, and from here on out, I'll probably just tweak it, and when I see it throwing over, I'll pull some settings back. If I see it never throwing over, well, then I'll speed it up. But I'd say I've probably got a little too fast right now just watching it. I am getting a few overthrows. So I probably need to slow it down a little bit, but that's the overview of how all the settings work. If you've got any feedback or input, or if there's something I've totally missed, feel free to leave a comment. But hopefully that's helpful for anybody with one of these who's looking to speed it up. Thanks.